All right, well, let's get started.
Let's do that.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Montessori Lives, conversations with notable Montessorians. And tonight we're very happy to welcome Roelie Hartwig, who is the creator of Montessori Tours and Travel, amongst many other things. So, Roelie, you're full of stories, and I hope we'll hear many of them tonight. But let's start with your story, your Montessori story. How did you get involved? How did you get pulled into this vortex of Montessori education?
Vortex is a great word, Mark. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Lovely to see everybody. Thanks for coming on this journey with me tonight. Well, I got into Montessori through my children, as many people have done. And on the recommendation of my sister, who lived in Auchenflower in Brisbane, she suggested that I enroll my firstborn into the Auchenflower Montessori Children's House that Jan Luff was running. Went and had a visit, was intrigued by what was going on. Being a primary school teacher in mainstream education in Queensland, it was something quite different that I was viewing that night. I couldn't get Kyron into that centre because he was too young, but we did enrol him in a small centre up at Ferny Hills in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. And one day at the sign-in desk was a little brochure from the NWEI training centre, training organisation. Do you want to know more about Montessori, with the big bold headlines on the front cover? And I thought to myself, yes, I do want to know more about this thing called Montessori. I vaguely remember hearing in one lecture in my teacher training, Steiner and Montessori and probably alternate education and goodness knows what else, all in one sentence, in one subject over 3 years. So I knew actually nothing about Montessori, but I read the book and I read the pamphlet, signed up for the course, did the, I think I'm not even sure what I came out with, but I finished the 3 to 6 course. And Susan Harris-Evans, that some of you may know from South Australia, was my tutor. And it was a wonderful, wonderful introduction to Montessori. It was also a wonderful, wonderful introduction to the kind of parenting that I wanted to do. From there, I was asked by Julia Harris if I would be the contact person for the very first 0 to 3 AMI course that was going to happen in Australia, which happened to be at the Gold Coast. And I'd known Julia for a long time after being involved with the Queensland Montessori Association. I said yes, and then one day I got a bolt from above that said, you could do this course. So I signed up for the 0 to 3, Monday to Friday. I left my life and 2 little boys in Brisbane and went to the Gold Coast to stay with my brother and his wife and his family, completed the 0 to 3, and then was invited to become involved in the planning committee for the Congress in Sydney in 2005. Put my hand up for that because I'm always up for an adventure, and this whole Montessori thing sounded really interesting, and people seem to like me and they seem to like what I do. So it's nice to gravitate to people who think that you're okay. And I ended up in Sydney at the initial meeting with Megan Tyne and the team from Sydney, and then became involved with the Congress. After I'd done the 0 to 3, I then turned around and signed up for the 3 to 6 that was happening in Sydney with Joan Bettman, another AMI diploma course. We finished the Congress on Sunday and I was back in lectures on the Monday. Consequently, I had a bit of a burnout after that. It was a bit of a challenge for me, work-wise, as well as family-wise, as well as me-wise. But it did introduce me to the greater world of Montessori rather than just, not just, I didn't mean that. It opened up a door for me to be more involved in the organisation on a global level and on an Australian level than working in a school. I worked at BMS for Brisbane Montessori School for a little while I was doing my 3 to 6, so that didn't add to my well-being. I must say that was a huge undertaking to be back working full-time in a Montessori environment with what I perceived to be limited knowledge and expertise. But I got through, almost got through, and then at some point soon after that, I actually got out of teaching after doing a stint in Moorabenda. So briefly, it was through my children initially, and then through connections that I made through my children in a Montessori centre.
What were some of the highlights that you remember from your time in the classroom?
Well, I had two classrooms. I set up a infant toddler group at Auchenflower where Jan had the Montessori Children's House. It was in the old stables of the old Presbyterian church in Auchenflower in Brisbane. And the church in front of the stables was empty. And I approached Jan and the committee to see if they would allow me to practice what I had learned in the AMI 0 to 3 diploma course. I didn't want to go through the whole childcare thing. I just wanted to provide an environment for the under threes with an adult in there accompanying them every day. And Jan was very excited to have that as a feeder into the kindergarten. Some of the, two highlights actually. I'm not sure whether the first one is a highlight, but I invited my dad, who was probably in his 70s at that point, and very traditional parenting style. My dad had quite the authoritarian of German descent. So I invited Dad down to the church to have a look at what I was doing. And he very politely sat at the back, didn't make any noise, didn't ask any questions, didn't get up and disturb anybody. But afterwards, he looked me squarely in the eye and he said, "Well, honey, I'm not quite sure what you're doing, but it looks like child labor to me." He saw desk washing, like table washing. He saw children cutting up food. He saw children dusting shelves. He saw children sweeping. So that was a bit of a highlight, but not kind of the highlight that I was hoping for. But I had his support all the way through. He knew that I was passionate about what I was doing and was very happy to help where he could. When I was working at BMS, there were two incidences that I will never forget. So I had already been through the MWEI course. I'd read a number of the books and written a few papers. I'd started the 3 to 6 course with AMI. And we talked a lot and I read a lot about concentration and how children who are deep in concentration will just continue on their chosen activity. And I thought, yeah, because I'd kind of seen it with my own children, but I hadn't actually seen it in an educational situation. And one day the boys decided, so the 4 and 5-year-old boys decided that they wanted to move the furniture and dust all the shelves. And as they were moving the furniture, I'll go back. One of the older girls was sitting at her desk doing some very complicated mathematics for a 5-year-old. About 2 meters, 3 meters behind her, the boys decided to move the bookcase, or the shelving rather, and it toppled and it went with a crash and everything just scattered across the floor. And there's one particular girl who I just happened to look at that moment, did not blink an eyelid and did not move except what she was concentrating on. And I thought, wow, I have seen it for myself, this deep, deep concentration that the children have. So that was the first one, Mark. And the second one was Friday afternoon. Now, if any of you have had any experience with Education Queensland Friday afternoon, it doesn't matter which year level you're working with, but Friday afternoon means free time, play sport, do art, do whatever you want to do, anything but anything academic. So that was in my head. This is what happens on a Friday afternoon. One of the 5-year-old boys had got the complicated long division with 2 divisors. He was so competent and he just kept working. And I had to stop him at about 3:10 when his mother was patiently waiting outside. I had to tell him it was time to pack away and he could continue on Monday, but really he had to go. And for me, that was a huge revelation that education, and I kind of knew this, but when you actually see it, it means so much more, that education is not prescribed by the timetable, that you do this from 9 till 12 and then you do this from that, and Friday you do this and Monday you do that. He was purely just following his heart and following his stream. And that was, it was probably more than how I can explain to you tonight, because it was quite a few years ago, but it did leave a very positive, encouraging and wonderful mark on my heart, just about how children learn and how they like to fill in their time. And why not do long division on a Friday afternoon? Why not? You know, nobody told him it was Friday afternoon and that really he should be doing something else, or thinking about afternoon tea with his friends at wherever. Yeah.
Your passion really shows through, Roelie, from Montessori. And you've also hinted at some of the challenges of being in the classroom that many of us face. What have you least loved about being a Montessori educator?
Oh, I have to go back a little bit, Mark. I was offered a job at Brisbane Montessori School. They had a sudden resignation, and Alan Cloden called me and asked if I would fill in the gap. And I had done the MWER course, but never put it in practice. It was just something I was doing out of interest. I hadn't started the 3 to 6 AMI at that point, but I remember they had an open day just before I was about to start, and I was there with a friend of mine who used to be a parent at Brisbane Montessori. And I remember just being devastated is not the right word. I'm not quite sure what it was, but I think overwhelmed, probably, walking through the open day, through the 3 to 6 environments and looking at the materials on the shelf and thinking, I don't know what to do with any of this stuff. What am I going to do with these children? And because I wanted to be the best Montessori teacher that there had ever been, or guide or educator, whatever word you want to use, my heart just sunk. And I thought, what am I going to do when I turn up on Friday and I'm the new teacher, educator? And I battled with that for nearly 3 years. And even after starting the 3 to 6 course and being guided through the materials and practicing in the afternoons and learning why we do it and how we do it and what it all means, I never felt that I was good enough to be a teacher. I never felt that I was going to get the hang of this material, particularly the maths. And I thought I was okay at maths, but I didn't understand, or I didn't understand all of the maths materials. I could get the children to a certain point, but after that, I wasn't sure. So I lived for nearly 3 years with a deep insecurity of my own ability. And I worked with that, the anxiety. Am I doing the right thing by the children? Am I following them enough? Am I talking to them with the right language? It was kind of like the parenting that I wanted to do at home, plus the teaching that I wanted to do in the classroom, that really was a huge challenge for me. And the staff were very supportive. It was a great place to work. I had some good mentors and some good people, but it was hard. And I think one of the reasons why I put my hand up to do the 3 to 6, I can honestly tell you this now, is that it was a break from the classroom and that I could deepen my knowledge of what I was being paid to do. Didn't quite match up the way that I thought it would, because I ended up being quite burnt out. And it wasn't until a few years after that that I got a job in an office in Longreach in Western Queensland, doing nothing to do with Montessori or education or parents or children. But I had the flexibility of being able to arrive anytime after 6 o'clock and leave anytime before 6 p.m. and get my job done, that I realized that a big chunk of the challenge was the fact that I was constricted by the regulations and the rules and the setup of a classroom. So I didn't even identify that at the time, but I realized later that added to my angst. So yeah, so it was a rather complex 3 years of my life, and there were some beautiful moments, and the children were wonderful. But for me, it was, I never thought that I was good enough. I never thought that I could. I never thought that I could provide for them what I wanted to provide for them. Yeah.
Well, work-life balance is, I think, it's a challenge for many Montessori teachers, and I imagine it was with 2 children at home as well.
Yeah.
So what did you do when you left the classroom? You were working in Longreach.
I was working in Longreach, but by that time I was quite involved with doing some volunteer and paid work for AMI based in Amsterdam, as well as for Montessori Australia. I don't know where I got my work ethic from, where I just felt I just needed to do all these things, but I did, and I have, and here I am still standing, so that's good. But I was working full-time, as well as doing jobs at night for Amsterdam, as well as doing jobs when I could for Australia. And I gave, so I left a job at Woorabinda, an Aboriginal community outside Rockhampton. I stayed there for nearly a year to help them out doing a Montessori program. Took the job in Longreach, but kept up my Montessori admin support and event support work, which I really loved that work. And then I gave the job in Longreach with Desert Channels Queensland. It was 8 wonderful years. I learned a whole heap about Western Queensland. So I gave them, I moved on from them to then do full-time, well, kind of full-time work, 3/4 time work probably, for AMI when they needed it, for Montessori Australia, a few hours a week. And then, but before that, I have to go back a little bit, Mark. In about 2006, just before the centenary of the Montessori movement and the conference in Rome in January 2007 to commemorate 100 years of the opening of the first Casa dei Bambini in San Lorenzo. There was a huge conference in Rome. And the lovely Pam Staten, who some of you will know, said to me sometime in 2006, Lord knows why she said it to me, but she did. She said, Roelie, why don't you organise a tour for the Australians to go to Italy for the conference, and then we tour Italy and go to the Netherlands? And I said, that's a good idea, Pam. So I did, with the help of a travel agent. And that was an interesting time. I was very green, but I had my travel agent with me, so it wasn't too challenging. And then I moved to Longreach and did some part-time work with Montessori and with my full-time work. And then in 2016, the same Pam Staten said to me, Roelie, we haven't had a tour for 10 years. Why don't you organise a tour through Italy and the Netherlands and end up in the Prague Congress in 2017? And I said, that's a good idea, Pam. And I did. And it was in that tour that some amazing things happened when I realised teaching was not for me and that I wanted to be able to provide amazing experiences for people in Italy and the Netherlands associated with Montessori. And so that was the catalyst for a change. Yeah.
Nobody says no to Pam Staten.
No, you're right. You wouldn't dare. That's exactly right. And I wouldn't dare either. But the funny thing is, she said to me when was the last conference in Congress in Bangkok? 2023. She said to me in 2022, Roelie, we haven't had a tour for a while. Why don't you do a pre-Congress tour and end up in Bangkok? And I said, that's a good idea, Pam. So I organised a tour, and then Pam promptly went off and did something completely different and didn't even come on my tour. So I'm learning to say no to Pam Staten because she let me down. But I did get to Vietnam, so that was nice. Yeah.
Oh. So how long has Montessori Tours and Travels been running, and where have you been?
Where have I been? Well, I set the business up in 2019 at the beginning of the year, and I took three Montessorians. One I knew before, and Ian, who was on here earlier, but I think he's had to duck off, and a lady from New Zealand, and we went to India. It was my first tour to India. I can't believe I did that because I'd never been to India. Really didn't know what I was doing, but everything went really well. And then I started, while I was during 2019, I started to work on other tours. I think there was Italy, the Netherlands, South Africa, I've got folders still sitting on my desktop that were to be started or to be, instigated, like a tour in 2020 and 2021. So they're still sitting on my folder, in folders on my desktop, waiting for another day and hoping that we don't have another COVID. So 2019 was the first tour, official tour under Montessori Tours and Travel. Yeah.
So tell us about India. What did you find out about Montessori and your life there?
Well, India was really interesting. As I said, I hadn't been there before. And luckily through my AMI connections over many years, I had a lot of people that I could call on for suggestions of where to go. And I'd met quite a few trainers, some of the Indian trainers as well, who were very helpful. Come to our training centre, go to this school, do this, do that. We went to Sri Lanka first and visited oh my gosh, it's just left me, St. Catherine's Training Centre in Colombo, one of the oldest training centres in that part of the world. And we went to the Nienhuis factory. That was the main reason to go to Sri Lanka. And that was really interesting to see the Nienhuis materials being made. And then in India, we visited the important places I thought that people may find interesting was the Theosophical Society in Chennai, because they're the people that invited Montessori to India. The Kalakshetra, which is also in Chennai, that was instrumental in publishing many of her books, and Montessori spent a lot of time in that space. as well as Kodaikanal, which is down in the south. It's a hill station where Montessorian Mario went not too long after they arrived in India. She was an older lady and her health was not what we might call 100%. And it was so hot and humid in Chennai. So they moved both Mario and Montessori to Kodaikanal, and that's where Mario worked a lot on the elementary program. And Mark, in my naivety of this whole travel business and what people might be interested in Montessori, I had this amazing thought that surely the primary teachers or the elementary teachers would love to come to Kodaikanal, because that's basically where the elementary primary, what we call primary, what Americans call elementary curriculum was created, like, or built up on. Anyway. Yeah.
Did she come up with cosmic education in India, or were there seeds?
I think so. Yeah.
Before she went to India,
she might have had the thought that I can't give you an accurate answer on that, but I think that what we now know as cosmic education, a lot of it was formulated and developed. And Mario worked with children in Kodaikanal as well, and there were children in Chennai as well. And Montessori was visiting schools in India as well. So they had a lot of contact with children and would be trying things, I'm sure. You know, she was such a scientist. There would be experiments, I'm sure, happening every time she traveled or was meeting with children, I would think.
Yeah.
I made that bit up, but I think that's what she possibly would have done.
Yeah. It does seem like there's a lot of influence from Indian culture in the cosmic education, that idea of connection, interconnection between everything. Although there is that idea also in some European Enlightenment and romantic philosophy, like Johann Goethe had the same idea of the interconnections of everything.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about the Theosophical Society and what their connection is with Montessori? Do you know much about them?
I wish I could. Let me just, for those of you that are listening tonight, I explained to Mark earlier that there's actually a lot of stories that I can't give much detail to because I have people who know the stories really well. So I know that Montessori heard, and I can't even think of his name, Mark, I'm sorry, I'm just having a mental block, but the president of the Theosophical Society was in England, maybe in London, when Montessori was there. And something that was said, they both realized that they were on a similar page in relation to how humans should interact on this planet. And they invited, the Theosophical Society invited Montessori to come to India and to spend time in India and to find out more about what they were doing. I actually don't know that much about the society. There are chapters of it around the world. I think there's one in Sydney. I think there's one in Brisbane, actually. I think I walked past it one day near Roma Street Railway Station, I think. But my understanding of the society is it's a very, you know, peace-loving, and people get on with each other, and it's for the greater good of the world and the greater good of humans, and be the best you can. Again, I'll stand corrected, and I'm sorry if I pass any information that's not correct tonight, but it was that association of Montessori meeting the president was the pivot for her to go to India. And then when Italy became an enemy to the Allies, and because India was under the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth, they were under house arrest and could not leave India, and they spent total of about 10 years in India. The first chunk was about 7 years. So she worked quite closely with the president and his wife, who was also a wonderful woman. I understand that they were both wonderful women, and they were thrilled that she was there. So when she was in India, she did a lot of training courses and did a lot of writing and trying to embrace the Indian culture as well. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't feel like I answered that question well.
That's fine, you did. But you said that in your naivety, you thought elementary teachers would want to go and see Kodaikanal. Was that not the case?
No, that wasn't the case. I had 3 people come, and one of them was not Montessori, but wanted to come because I'd organized the tour. But yeah, and that's okay, because it was early days and I had a very limited mail out list, and I'd only really just started to get into Facebook and Instagram, not for a while. LinkedIn, I wasn't on. So my pool of people was not as high as it would have been. And I've learned a lot since 2019. I'm still on a steep learning curve as to when to have a tour and how to market it and all of that. But in a way, I also don't want it to be so big that I'm never home. I love Western Queensland, where my house is, and I do like to go back there because that's home. But I also like to travel, and I like to be with my global Montessori community. So the tours ticks all of those boxes and allows me to go back home at some point.
Well, tell us about Italy. When did you first take a tour to Italy?
Oh, well, the first one was in 2007.
2007, yeah.
And I had very limited connections, but it was enough to get a tour through. Eileen, you were on that one, weren't you? You said you were in that one. Would you like to say anything about your experience? I don't want to put you on the spot, so no is an okay answer, but can you remember any highlights about that tour that you were on?
Yeah, I thought it was fabulous because to see her first classroom, and well, we went to the conference first, and then Maxine and I went visiting while we waited for Pam and Amy to finish their trainer thing, and then off we went. And there was one thing that I really wanted to see was Montessori's grave. And remember, it was such a dreadful storm. And I was sitting in the back seat of the bus, and I thought, well, come on, God, this is why I came. I wanted to see her grave. And it was so bad, you could hardly walk. And we visited a school there, and we're just about knocked over getting out of the bus. But you won't believe it. But on the way, they said, I don't know that we will. But all that just calmed down, and there was no rain when we got to her grave. So it was just a wonderful experience. And also when we saw Sophia.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, who did the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. Yeah, that was brilliant too. Yeah, the whole thing was just wonderful. Mm. I'd love to go again, but I don't think I can.
Oh. Well, thanks, Eileen. Yeah, it was a really remarkable tour, and it was lovely for me to be able to pull in my connections as well as do this thing. And after that tour, I had no thought at all about doing it again. I honestly didn't. I was busy with my own life. Later, with a different crew of people, similar tour but a little bit different. And now every tour in Italy is a little bit different. So Cara, if you come again, or Eileen, if you come again, and Vicky, when you come, it will be completely different to not completely different, because there are some things that we always do. But my colleague in Italy, Karen Slauberg, who's a newborn expert, newborns and 0 to 3 are her passion, and she's also an Italian speaker and has a very deep knowledge of Montessori history. And we try every tour to, how can we make it better from the last one? What do we want to achieve this time? Where will we go this time? And she's continually getting pieces of the puzzle of Montessori's life in Rome before she really started promoting her method, and the connections and the puzzle pieces that are joining together are really quite extraordinary. Which, can I then move on, Mark, before you ask me another question? I just like everybody to know why I do the tours, and it's to help everybody have a deeper understanding of who Dr. Maria Montessori was, where she had come from, and not only the work that she did, but also the influences of society and the influences of the rich and influential and what do we call them now? Not trendsetters, influencers, is that the word? But the important people who were also doing amazing things for women and children. Like there was the network of what was happening in the early 1900s is really, I think, very interesting, and it gives a much better understanding of who she was as a person, where she came from, what she was dealing with, what else was happening in Rome, what else was happening in Italy that charted the course for her, and particularly the influential women who supported her work, helped her write her books, probably marketed what she was doing, spread the word amongst the aristocrats in Italy and beyond. Yeah, so So the historic tours that I do are to help people have a deeper understanding of who she was as a person and what her life was like. That's one part of the tours. The other part of the tours that I do are legacy tours. So we go to places like Vietnam, like Kenya, where Montessori did not visit, but there are Montessori schools there. And it's interesting to see the legacy of Montessori in a country with a different language, different culture to Italy or the Netherlands or Spain or India, the places where she spent a lot of time, or the USA, and just see how Montessori is applied and how it works for children of all cultures. On the tours, I try to divide it up at about a third of Montessori history or legacy, a third of cultural experiences, and then a third of free time, so that adults can go out and do their own thing, go and see what they want to see what they need to do, buy what they need to buy. Yeah, so try to keep that balance. I think too much Montessori is not good. You go home and your head's spinning and you can't even remember what you did that morning, let alone what you did 3 days ago. So trying to keep the balance of that is very important. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about the women who supported her? Yeah, it seems like she was fairly mistreated by a lot of men at the time in her life. Montesano, of course, and then I saw the French film La Nouvelle Femme yesterday, and I remember a scene where she's talking. The French woman who brings her own daughter to the orthophoenic school. She I think she was asking Montessori, why do you live with your parents? Why don't you live by yourself? And she said, well, I'm not paid. And I remember the audience in the theater, several in the audience gasping that, and she said, oh, well, Dr. Montesano is paid, but I'm not. And it was a bit shocking because it was clear from the movie that it was all her work. And she was really the driving force behind it. But she had to, even when they were talking to the press, Montesano would step forward and always, take credit for it, but she was sort of left in the background. And there was once time when she stepped forward and tried to talk about it. And she said, a lot of my work is really about motherhood and love. The love of a mother is what really drives it. And, that really put Montesano in his place, but tell us more about the women who were really behind her.
Yeah. Well, there's three main women that come to mind pretty quickly. When Montessori started to observe what was happening in the first Casa dei Bambini, word just sort of got out within the Rome area of what was happening with this childcare and these children in this desolate place called San Lorenzo. And a couple called Alice, and Alice is how we would call her name. She was from the United States, who married into the Franchetti family. Leopoldo was her husband. They got word of what was happening down in Rome, that there was something a little bit different. So they had an apartment in Rome, but they also had a place called Villa Montesca, which is a couple of hours out of Rome, near Perugia and near Città di Castello. So they got wind of what was going on and came down and had a look at what was happening in their first Casa dei Bambini. And story goes that Leopold said to Maria, you've got to write this down, because what would happen if you got run over by a horse tomorrow, or the bus ran you, or you slipped, or something happened to you? Nobody would have any record of what was going on. We will help you. So they were very wealthy landowners. They had a huge estate, huge villa, they had lots of farmers in their own home on their estate, all working for the estate. Many of them had children. And Alice had already been providing for the children of the farmers. Like, this is even before she knew about Montessori. Cara, just correct me if I'm making any errors here. Cara's heard this story too as well. So Alice already had this interest in women and in children. And when she saw what was happening in Rome, she wanted to find out more about that, and basically said, we will support you. stay in our apartment in Rome, come to the villa, work with the children, try things out, whatever. So they had influence and they had money. And Leopoldo Franchetti actually had her book published in Città di Castello, which is the first book, which has a very long name that then got shortened to it. And Cara, what's the first book called? The Absorbent Mind, The Secret of Childhood.
The original was very long, like 20 words long, the scientific exploration of the something Montessori method. Yeah. So which was then shortened to the Montessori method.
Yeah. So without those influential and rich people saying, we like what you do and we think that you need to do something about this to spread the word, you know, who knows where we would be now. There was and Alice Franchetti was also working with the women in the farms in relation to spinning yarn and then weaving. And she helped set up a factory in Città di Castello and provided a childcare on site for the children of the weavers and the spinners to look after the children while they were working. So this is back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, probably probably a new thing, but it worked, and it gave the women employment, it gave them money, and the children were well looked after and educated. Another woman called, I'm just going to call her Mrs. Sorbello, who also came from married into a very rich family. She was also from the United States, had connections, had money. The husband had money, and they were doing something similar north of Perugia. They all got together, the three of those women, and made things happen, again, because they had the influence and they had the money. And then further down the track, when you get up into the northern parts of Italy in Gonzaga, where the Gonzaga family got wind of Maria Montessori, and there's a lovely photo of Mrs. Gonzaga in Rome with Maria Montessori. She was also very instrumental in helping support Montessori in relation to material making and supporting her for her work. I think I can sit here tonight and honestly say I don't recall hearing of any male who provided the same level of support emotionally, I would imagine emotionally, certainly financially, and certainly influentially as the women did of that time. It was an era where women were starting to earn money, and those that had married into money were helped making it easier for women who had no money and had no means of making money until the women got involved. So that's just a really short snapshot, Mark, and it's all of those kind of little pieces that come together where you I certainly have realized that Montessori's life is not what you hear about in a lecture, or if you're doing a course, or maybe even you read a book, because the connections are so widespread that all helped make Montessori's journey the way it was, certainly in Italy. And that's sort of more the historic part that I know most of and that I have the best stories for. There's a lot of history in India as well, and I'm sure even though there were men in India that were helping her, Jewston and the Theosophical Society president, and I can't think of any other names, but there were other men that also took it on board. But from my perspective, it really was women supporting women kind of movement at that time, all doing amazing things for children and for women.
Yeah, it's certainly remarkable how tough Montessori was. She was really a tough cookie.
Yes.
There was a lot in her life, and it showed up in that French film too.
Yes.
A lot in her life that we would probably now call trauma. But probably wasn't considered that then because it was par for the course. But what are some of the things that she went through that were really quite traumatic in her life?
The ones that come quickly to mind is that she was devastated when her mother died. She was an only child and very close to her mum, and she wore black for a lot of years, just in a state of mourning for the loss of her mother. When she went to the States, it might have been her second trip, correct me if anybody knows better, but when she was in the States, she had wind that her father had passed away, and she wasn't able to be there for him as he was dying. And that, from what I've read, that was very traumatic for her. Having a child, falling pregnant out of wedlock, that in itself would have been an incredible stressful moment. choosing to have the baby. There probably was no other choice, unless you might have gone to see somebody who was very dodgy and might have made life even worse than the situation. But choosing to have the child and then give up the child would have been an enormous amount of trauma. And then visiting the child and the child not knowing that that child that you have born and is watching grow, but not every day and not part of that child's life, not even calling you mum or mother or mama, or from what I understand, Mario referred to her as that nice lady, or she was a long distant aunt or something. Like, he didn't know that Maria was his mother for quite a few years. And then Montesano, who she loved, I'm assuming she loved deeply, went off and married somebody else, even though they had a pact that they would never marry after they broke up. And then also, Mark, though, you mentioned about her not being able to have a voice when it came to her work, and that Montesano got a lot of the credit, and her not being paid. That went on for quite a few years. That at the university, she was working as hard as any other person in those roles, but getting nothing for it, purely because she was a woman. So every day there would have been a reminder: you are a woman and you are not worthy of financial support. You are a mother, you are a woman, and you can't do this, you can't do that. So I think I haven't actually thought too much about what trauma she lived with, but I would imagine she lived with an enormous amount of trauma that would have had to be packaged up and filed away somewhere, so that she could get on with what she loved and what she was dedicated to and what she devoted her life to. So, yeah.
It seems to me, from what I know of her life, that at a certain point, she just decided, I can't trust anybody else. I mean, there was Sam McClure, who took advantage of her on that first trip to the United States, I think 1913, and tried to make money from her to revive his magazine. And probably others as well. But, her father, I guess, was also not supportive of her initially.
And even just hearing you say that made me think of even the political situation at the time, where Mussolini signed, he was the first president of the Opera Nationale Montessori, and then he turned on her and burnt her books, closed her schools, and basically she had to leave. I imagine she felt like she had to leave the country. So even her country let her down. Not only her mother by dying, and her father by dying, and her lover by abandoning her, marrying somebody else. Her child had to be given away. No support at the university. Her country let her down. The leaders let her down. Yeah.
Do you think at a certain point she decided, I can't trust anyone except my family? And that's perhaps why she was so close to Mario for the rest of her life.
I think that's a very acceptable comment. Yeah. Yeah.
What else have you discovered about Montessori's life from your tours in Italy and the Netherlands? Maybe talk about her life in the Netherlands.
She ended up in the Netherlands as a safe place to be after the war had settled down, and I'm a little shaky on the history of that, Mark, so if anybody can fill me in, please do. The house that she lived in is really a lovely house in a wonderful part of Old Amsterdam, and that's where the AMI headquarters are now. She wanted to be buried wherever she died. The family, the greater family, had a holiday house at Noordwijk by the sea, which is where she would have holidays. And that's she and Mario were there discussing an possible upcoming trip to Africa when she passed away. And she's buried in the Noordwijk Catholic Cemetery. There are some schools, just talking from my tours, there are some schools that we can visit. Some of you may know Simone Davis from Australia, who is running a 0 to 3 environment in Amsterdam. I like to go and visit her just to hear another Aussie and to see what she's doing. And she runs a really neat show. There's also some public high schools and some primary schools, probably been more to high schools than the primary schools. Nienhuis office and museum area and their big warehouse is not too far away. I like to visit Nienhuis to show support. I've known Chris Williamson for a long time, and he's always very open for my groups to go there and visit. So we learn a little bit about the Nienhuis history. Now, that was a man who supported Montessori, Albert Nienhuis. And we visit the grave, and then actually we often then just have more of a cultural experience. We try to get into AMI if we can, if the office is not busy, and sit in the study where Montessori worked, which is something really special. And it wasn't until the tour in 2017 where we were all allowed to troops up to the study, and I could see people sitting on her desk and running their hands along the top of the desk, and I could just see their head going, this is the desk that Montessori wrote at. I am sitting at the desk where Montessori worked. And it was like, oh my goodness. No, it was like this great pilgrimage to just be in the space. The same as in the birth house in Yarra Valley. I'm standing in the house where she was born. Yeah, so little moments like that just really egged me on to provide opportunities for people to have that experience. And there's so much wonderful culture in the Netherlands that we probably do more cultural activities in the Netherlands than we do in Italy. So it's a slightly different tour. Yeah.
And she was sponsored there by the Pearson family.
Yes.
Right? And Ada Pearson became Mario's wife, or second wife.
Second wife. Yeah. And now the Pearson Publishing Company publishes only Montessori books, and Alexander Henney is he was I think the creator of the publishing company. He's now stepping down a little bit, and I think his daughter is carrying on the tradition of that. So the links in the Netherlands are pretty strong. She also had a school. There was a school in Laren, which is not too far out of Amsterdam. The people who own the house where the family lived don't really like it when groups of travellers come by and stop outside their gate and can see the fingers being pointed. This is the house where, so I tend not to go there anymore because it's just a house, and there's not, well, certainly in my history presentations or the stories that are shared in Amsterdam, there's not that much that's spoken about Laren and what happened there. But the connections are strong, particularly for the last years of Montessori's life. Yeah.
What do you know about Albert Nienhuis and how they met, and what did he do for Montessori? Was he one of the first carpenters who made her material?
Yeah. That piece of the puzzle I can't tell you right now, Mark, I'm sorry, but it would have been a connection. Somebody knew somebody who knew Albert, who old Montessori saw what he had done. Perhaps it was in a school. She liked the furniture, the weight was good. And who made these? This man did, and so conversations happened. But Nienhuis had the blueprints that have come specifically from Montessori. This is how it has to be. These dimensions, this weight, this type of timber, this color. So Nienhuis and Gonzaga Reddy both have what they call the blueprints of the Montessori materials, and they are the officially recognized manufacturers of Montessori, and it goes way back to the days when she was alive and she could control. And maybe just back to your comment earlier about her trauma, Mark, maybe with the apart from the scientific requirement to have materials to be a certain weight and size and dimension and color, etc., that was something also that she had control over. I like what you do, work with me, but this is how it has to be. And she ran that ship pretty tightly from what I gather.
What's the connection with Gonzaga Reddy?
Similar story. I'll just call her Mrs. Gonzaga, who was part of the Gonzaga family, very wealthy. They owned a huge area of Italy back before Italy became one nation. And Montessori somehow met up with her, and there was a little school in Gonzaga, which is a tiny town, tiny village. And there was I think Montessori might have been asking, is there anybody locally who does carpentry work? And so she was introduced to the carpenter in Gonzaga, and you can still see the shop where he worked. It's not too far from where the Gonzaga Reddy Museum is. And so Montessori worked with him up in that northern part of Italy to, again, produce the materials. And she had a lot of support from the Gonzaga family. She stayed at the Villa Alessia, which is just outside Gonzaga. And Cara, we didn't do that this trip, but on the extended Italy trip, it's a lovely villa to go and see, you know, just to experience how the rich and wealthy and influential lived back in the day when the wealthy families owned chunks of controlled chunks of Italy, and the Gonzaga family was one of those.
So they were the first manufacturers before Nienhuis, right?
Yes, yeah. That's my understanding. Yes, it would have been because she was more based in Italy. Well, I'm thinking, yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
And in the Gonzaga-Ready office, which is now GAM, capital GAM, which actually now sits under Hoytink, but where Nienhuis also sits. So Hoytink is the mothership, and Nienhuis now sits under that, Nienhuis International, and so does Gonzaga-Ready. And Michaeli and Chris, Michaeli from Gonzaga-Ready and Chris from Nienhuis work very closely together. But they have a beautiful new building, and there's a lovely timeline of Montessori's history and some of the original Montessori materials, which are always fascinating to see because the colors are different. Some of the other things are different, but it's lovely. And Michaeli does a really good rendition of the story of Gonzaga-Ready. So another historical puzzle put together.
Roelie, you said you also take tours to Kenya and Vietnam. Can you talk about the connection there?
Oh, sure. Well, the Vietnam one was just before the Thailand conference, and I don't have another Vietnam tour on the books, but if anybody says to me, I've got 3 friends who want to go to Vietnam, can you organize a tour? I'll happily work with you to do that. So that was an opportunity to just go to Vietnam and end up in Thailand. I didn't want to do any tours through Thailand because I knew the Thai Congress were planning their own post-Congress tours, and I didn't want to offer something in Thailand before the Congress when there were so many options after the Congress. So Vietnam seemed a nice option, particularly for Australians. There's a lot of Aussies that love to go to Vietnam. So that we visited schools in Hanoi, Hoi An, and then in Saigon, and we did a lot of fun things as well as some cultural things. And the funnest thing, if any of you have ever been to any big city in Vietnam, you know how crazy the traffic is. The funnest thing was being on the back of a Vespa at nighttime, riding on the streets of Saigon, going from cafe to restaurant to street cart to whatever, holding on very tightly. And then Kenya, well, for those of you that might be following anything to do with AMI over the last 10 years, you may have heard of the Corner of Hope, which was it's a long story and I won't go into it now. You can Google it and get the story yourself. But there were displaced people in Kenya that wanted to do something for the children. And through various means and connections and fortuitous moments, AMI got involved in that project. And now 12 years later, there's a school that was made by the people that were displaced and living with trauma and really had nowhere to go and decided to put their energies into doing something for the children. So they built the school. The women learned how to sew. They got donations of sewing machines. The children had uniforms made, and then funding was available for adults who showed interest and expertise, maybe not expertise, interest and enthusiasm to go off and do AMI training. And I've been following that since the very first year that Lynn Lawrence, who's the executive director of AMI, started to tell us about this situation in Kenya. And I knew nothing about it in Australia. You know, there's a lot of news we don't get here in Australia. So one day, probably a few years ago before COVID, I thought I'd really like to go to Kenya and just see what this Corner of Hope is like. And I was fortunate to be able to do a familiarization tour last year with the woman who started up a company called Raw Africa. Her name is Brooke, and she's based in Melbourne, and she's been doing trips to Kenya for a very long time. She worked for Victoria Zoo and was doing, I think, rhino projects in Kenya. So what she doesn't know about Kenya and traveling in Kenya is not worth knowing. And she was happy to hear my story and happy to work with me. So we've put together like a Raw Africa tour, but we've taken bits out and we've slotted in a trip to see what the Corner of Hope is all about and meet the teachers who were there right from the word go and meet the students and see what's going on, as well as go and visit one of the very remote schools that have been set up through an initiative of one of the local girls from Kenya who shared her dream at an Éducateurs Sans Frontières that I went to in Stellenbosch in 2018 in South Africa. And then it happened. And now there are 4 schools for remote nomadic communities where instead of the school going with the nomadic children, the school is stationary and the children get to stay with many of the women and the aunties and the grandmas while the men go off and do their nomadic hunting or collecting and gathering, whatever the men do when they leave, but they come back. So that's something really special too, to see this wonderful tent that's there in the middle of the bush, and what a beautiful space that they have created. And that's funded by the Sarara Foundation, which has a very expensive, amazing, which I didn't go to, but an amazing resort up in the hills where you just look out over the plains. And they've got a lot of money that they put into these schools, as well as environmental projects. So that's Kenya. We'll be looking for elephants and giraffes and rhinos and crocodiles, no, alligators, no, giraffes and elephants and Kenya wildlife, and looking at the beautiful scenery and having an amazing experience. And it's not a 5-star drive up and you get out in the port and everything's air conditioned and it's all very Western and very big city. It's far from that, but the scenery is amazing and the Maasai people are so beautiful. And if you've never been to anywhere in Africa, please consider coming to Kenya for your first Kenyan experience, and have a little dabble in Montessori as well, and just see what the people are doing, the initiatives that are happening there. We also hope to go to the training centre in Nairobi just to meet the trainers there and see what's going on. They're celebrating 50 years of being a training centre this year, which will carry over to next year. So that's Kenya. That was Vietnam. There's a trip to Japan in May, looking at a couple of aged care centres and those that are using the Montessori approach. Again, it's only 2 days out of 7. And if you wanted to come, if you didn't know, Osaka is having World Expo next year, and we will be there during World Expo, and we will be in Osaka. So if you're looking for a reason to go and see World Expo and also just see what's happening with aged care in Japan and eat lots of lovely Japanese food, then you might like to come on this tour. And one thing I want to say about my tours too is that if there's something you don't ever want to do, like I really don't want to see a school, you don't have to. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. As long as you're on the bus when you have to be and you're on the plane when you have to be, I don't mind what you do, but it would be lovely to have your company. Because there's something really special about traveling with like-minded people. And that's one of the things I love about what I do, that I get to travel with my global Montessori community.
Really, is there anything that you've learned about organizing tours in the many years that you've been doing this that you wish you'd known when you started? Any tidbits of wisdom that you've picked up about organizing tours and making them so successful?
I'm learning to pack lightly. I'm learning that. Mark, I think probably what I've had to work on and to be very aware of is to be on high alert at all times. Now, when I've organised an itinerary of something that I think people will enjoy, and then people come to me with that trust that I'm going to provide for them and create experiences that they may or may not enjoy, that's out of my control. But it's actually a very tiring job, and I'm learning that one of the things I'm learning every tour is how to best pace myself so that I don't go home totally exhausted and that I have enough energy to, just keep going. So every tour is different, and every tour I learn something more about myself and about the needs of a group. But every group is so different. I went through India with a group of Americans before I did my Italy tour in October, and oh my goodness, traveling. I'll just say that every nationality is very different to any other nationality, and it was a wonderful trip in India, but so different to traveling with a group of Aussies, because you just when you travel with like-minded people. I feel like I'm digging a hole really deep here. When you travel with people who speak the same language and you have similar experiences, it makes it so much easier. But yeah, but every tour is different, and I learn something new every tour. But so I can't really tell you, Mark, of anything specific that I have learned about this, except to be highly organized. Highly organized. Yeah.
Would anybody else like to ask anything of Roelie or make a comment?
Someone asked me today, is there a country in the world that has a really generous proportion of Montessori education? I wondered if Holland, Netherlands fell into that category, or if there is, or if it's just like Australia where it's sporadic.
Vicky, I do know that in India there are massive schools. Like there's one, I think it's in Lucknow, where there's, I don't know, 1,000 students, 1,200 students. The population is so huge though, so the percentage of Montessori, the percentage of students in Montessori may not be any greater than the percentage of Australians in Montessori schools. So I think that's a hard question to answer because the population numbers are so different. Mark, have you got a comment about that? Would you know just from your work? I know there's a lot of schools in the States. Yeah.
I was under the impression that the Netherlands had a higher percentage, and perhaps Thailand also had higher percentages than most countries.
Vicky, it's also a hard question to answer because, as you know, as we all know, there's Montessori and there's something else. So, you know, we bandy this word around, but what do we actually mean when we say how many Montessori schools are there in a country? What are we actually asking? How many have a sign out their front that says Montessori? How many of them are actually following the philosophy and doing what's best for the child? How many? Yeah. So
that actually came up in conversation during our trip. I believe it may have been you or it may have been Karen that Ireland was a particularly.
Oh yes.
Yeah. The Ireland was doing very, very, very well with Montessori, particularly Montessori trained educators.
Yeah. Thanks, Cara. I had forgotten that. Yeah.
Well, really, we could continue talking for hours. You've got so many interesting stories from your work with Montessori tours and travels. But we better call it a night for now, and I hope to have you again on again another time. But thank you again for your time. It's been fascinating.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for listening, everybody. I get a bit carried away when I talk about something I'm very excited about and very passionate about. But thank you. Thank you for joining me tonight. Yeah.
Thank you, Roelie.
Lovely to see you, Roelie.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah. Thanks, Eileen. Good to see you.
Thanks
everybody who I can't see. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining us for Montessori Lives. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.